It began as a whisper in a private drawing room, too quiet for headlines, too urgent to ignore. When Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged from that closed-door meeting, something had shifted, not just in their expressions, but in the fragile balance of royal power itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The meeting itself was never meant to surface, at least not in the way it did. Officially, it was described as a routine consultation, one of many quiet discussions that take place behind palace walls, where tradition and law intersect in ways the public rarely sees. But insiders would later suggest that the tone of that gathering was anything but routine. Present in the room were not only William and Catherine, but a select group of senior constitutional advisors, figures who do not convene unless something of real consequence is unfolding. And while no formal statement was ever released, the instructions that followed spoke louder than any confirmation. Palace aides were reportedly told to limit communication, to avoid unnecessary speculation, and above all, to maintain silence. That level of discretion was unusual, even by royal standards. The monarchy thrives on controlled messaging, but it rarely retreats into complete stillness unless the situation demands it. And something clearly demanded it. Catherine's appearance in the hours that followed only deepened the sense of unease. Those who observed her closely noted a shift, not dramatic, not overt, but unmistakable. She appeared pale, withdrawn, her composure intact, yet carrying an undercurrent of concern that could not be easily dismissed. It was the kind of subtle change that doesn't create headlines immediately, but lingers long enough to raise questions. William, too, seemed different. His public engagements continued, his demeanor as composed as ever, yet there was a new layer of calculation in his interactions. He spoke carefully, chose his words with precision, and maintained a level of guardedness that hadn't gone unnoticed. For a figure so accustomed to balancing duty with approachability, this shift was significant. It suggested not panic, but preparation and awareness that something delicate was unfolding beneath the surface. Royal correspondents began to pick up on it, though cautiously. At first, the murmurs were scattered small observations, quiet remarks that something felt off. But as days turned into weeks, those murmurs began to align. Reports hinted at deeper tensions, at discussions that extended beyond routine matters, at decisions that could carry long-term implications. No one was willing to say exactly what it was, not yet. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Because what unfolded in that room was never just about procedure. It was about something far more sensitive, something tied to the future, to legacy, and to the invisible lines that define who stands where within the monarchy. And as those lines began to blur, even slightly, the consequences were bound to ripple outward. But what began as a quiet internal discussion would soon unravel into something far more consequential, reaching beyond palace walls and into the very structure of succession itself. For decades, the line of succession seemed immovable, etched in tradition, protected by protocol. But beneath that certainty lay a rarely discussed question: who truly belongs within the circle of royal inheritance? The answer, at least on paper, appears straightforward. The British line of succession is governed by law structured through centuries of constitutional evolution, reinforced by Parliament, and anchored in principles that prioritize direct royal bloodline above all else. It is not shaped by emotion, proximity, or influence. It is defined by birth, legitimacy, and a carefully preserved order that leaves little room for ambiguity. And yet, as history has shown time and again, what is written in law does not always reflect what unfolds behind palace doors. Because the monarchy is not just a legal system, it is a living institution. And within that institution exists a delicate balance between those born into its core and those who orbit it. The distinction between royal bloodline and extended family has always been clear in theory, but far more complicated in practice. Marriages bring new figures into the fold. Relationships expand influence. And over time, lines that once felt rigid can begin to blur, not through official decree, but through subtle shifts in presence, visibility, and access. It is within this context that the role of families like that of Queen Camilla becomes particularly sensitive. Her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, have never held positions within the line of succession. Legally, their place is clear. They remain outside the framework that determines the monarchy's future. But the question that has quietly lingered is not about legality. It is about perception, about proximity, about how visibility within royal spaces can sometimes be interpreted as something more than it officially is. History offers its own warnings. There have been moments, quiet adjustments, legislative refinements where the rules governing succession were revisited, reshaped to reflect changing times. Each of those moments carried weight, not just because of what changed, but because of what it revealed. That even the most established systems are not entirely immune to pressure. And while those changes were always formal, deliberate, and transparent, they left behind a lingering awareness that the structure, though strong, is not entirely untouchable. In recent years, that awareness has grown sharper. Reports suggest that within palace circles, there has been increasing sensitivity around how extended family members are perceived in relation to the institution itself. Not because they hold power in a constitutional sense, but because influence can take many forms. Invitations, appearances, associations, these small details, when accumulated, begin to shape a narrative. And in a monarchy built on clarity and order, even the suggestion of ambiguity can become a source of unease. That unease does not erupt all at once. It builds quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. Subtle tensions begin to surface. Conversations shift in tone. What was once accepted without question becomes subject to scrutiny, and those within the institution, particularly those tasked with safeguarding its future, begin to look more closely at the boundaries they are meant to protect. Because at its core, this is not just about rules, it is about identity. About defining who stands within the structure and who remains beyond it. And when that definition starts to feel uncertain, even in the slightest way, it creates a ripple effect that touches every level of the monarchy. And it was within this fragile gray area between tradition and modern reality that the first real signs of conflict began to surface. Insiders had long whispered that Queen Camilla operated quietly but effectively behind palace doors. But what was once dismissed as social diplomacy was now being viewed through a far more serious lens. For years, her presence within the royal structure had been carefully balanced, almost understated in its execution. She was never the loudest voice in the room, never the one drawing overt attention. And yet, those familiar with the inner workings of palace life often suggested that influence does not always announce itself, it settles. It expands, it weaves its way into conversations and decisions until it becomes impossible to separate presence from power. What made this moment different was not the existence of that influence, but the growing perception of how far it might extend. Reports began to surface quiet at first, almost reluctant, suggesting that Camilla's reach within royal social and internal circles had deepened in recent years. Invitations, appearances, private gatherings, each one, on its own, insignificant. But together, they formed a pattern. A pattern that some began to interpret not as coincidence, but as positioning. And at the center of that interpretation were her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes. Their presence at elite events, their increasing visibility within spaces, traditionally reserved for those tied directly to the monarchy, it did not go unnoticed. Officially, nothing had changed. Their status remained the same, their roles undefined within the formal structure of the crown. But perception operates differently from protocol. It is shaped not by what is declared, but by what is seen, repeated, and gradually accepted. And for those who view the monarchy as an institution that depends on clarity, even the slightest suggestion of overlap between royal authority and extended family presence becomes a point of concern. That concern, according to various interpretations, was not rooted in hostility but in preservation. Traditionalists within the institution, those who have long guarded its boundaries, began to question whether those lines were being softened, not through policy, but through proximity. Because proximity over time can evolve into influence, and influence, if left undefined, can create uncertainty in a system that relies on precision. Speculation followed, as it always does. Some suggested that this was simply the natural evolution of a modern monarchy, adapting to a broader, more inclusive social environment. Others, however, interpreted it differently. They saw intention where others saw coincidence. They questioned whether this growing visibility hinted at a longer-term positioning within royal networks, one that, while unofficial, could carry its own form of weight. The media, sensing the shift, began to ask its own questions. Carefully at first, then with increasing confidence. Articles appeared, Analyses emerged, and what had once been confined to private conversations began to edge into public discourse. Not accusations, not confirmations, but questions. Persistent, unavoidable questions that refused to settle. And within those questions lay the real tension, not in what was happening on the surface, but in what it might represent beneath it. Because if influence was indeed expanding in ways that blurred the boundaries between institution and extension, then the issue was no longer about individuals, it was about the structure itself, about how it defines its limits and how it protects them. What had once been subtle influence was now being interpreted as something more deliberate and, for some, more concerning. There was no public announcement, no dramatic statement. But within palace corridors, a coordinated response was quietly taking shape, led by those who saw themselves as guardians of the monarchy's future. If the previous tension had been subtle, this phase was deliberate. It did not unfold in front of cameras or through carefully worded press releases. It unfolded in meetings, in briefings, in conversations that carried a weight far beyond their measured tone. At the center of it stood Prince William, no longer just observing the shifting dynamics, but stepping into a role that required precision, restraint, and above all, resolve. Reports suggest that he had begun initiating internal reviews, quiet examinations of succession clarity, not because the law had changed, but because its perception might have. And in an institution where perception can shape reality, that distinction mattered more than ever. What made this moment even more significant was the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, at his side, not as a passive observer, but as an increasingly active participant in these discussions. Those familiar with the situation describe her involvement as measured yet firm, grounded in an understanding that the monarchy's strength lies in its consistency. She was not reacting to speculation. She was engaging with the deeper question beneath it: how to preserve the integrity of an institution that depends on clear boundaries, even as those boundaries face subtle pressure. The language used within these discussions was careful, almost clinical. Phrases like protecting the integrity of the crown and reinforcing institutional clarity began to surface not in public, but in the internal framing of the issue. Senior advisors, individuals whose roles are defined by their distance from public scrutiny, were reportedly tasked with exploring potential legal interpretations. Not changes, not immediate actions, but interpretations, clarifications, the kind of groundwork that precedes decisions without announcing them. And as those interpretations took shape, something else began to emerge: alignment. Not forced, not declared, but gradually forming among key figures within the royal structure. Conversations that once existed in isolation began to connect. Perspectives that might have differed started to converge. Insiders would later describe it as the formation of a unified front, though not in the confrontational sense the phrase might suggest. This was not about opposition. It was about cohesion, about ensuring that those responsible for the monarchy's future were moving in the same direction, even if that direction had yet to be revealed. The urgency behind these efforts was controlled, almost understated, but it was there. It could be felt in the pacing of decisions, in the careful calibration of responses, in the refusal to allow speculation to dictate action. Because this was not a situation that could be addressed through reaction alone. It required strategy. It required foresight. And perhaps most importantly, it required patience, the kind that allows a response to take shape fully before it is ever seen. Yet beneath that patience lay an undeniable truth. Something was shifting. Not in a way that could be easily defined, but in a way that could not be ignored. The monarchy was adjusting, recalibrating, reinforcing its own structure in response to pressures that were as much about perception as they were about reality. And those leading that effort understood the stakes. Because once such a process begins, it does not remain contained. It expands, it influences, it reaches beyond its original scope. And even the most carefully managed decisions carry consequences that extend further than intended. Yet even as plans were being shaped in silence, the implications of those decisions threatened to ripple far beyond the palace itself. The moment it surfaced, it was no longer containable. What had been guarded behind palace walls suddenly entered the public sphere, triggering headlines, speculation, and a wave of unanswered questions. It did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a pattern too consistent to ignore. Subtle shifts in scheduling, carefully worded statements that said very little, yet seemed to carry more weight than usual. Journalists began to notice. At first, the coverage was cautious phrases like unusual internal movement and heightened discretion appearing in columns that rarely relied on uncertainty. But caution does not last long when curiosity takes hold. Within days, what had been quiet observation turned into active inquiry, and the narrative began to build momentum of its own. Major outlets started connecting the dots. Royal commentators, many of whom had spent years interpreting the rhythms of palace life, began to suggest that something more significant was unfolding beneath the surface. Not a scandal, not a crisis in the traditional sense, but a recalibration, a possible redefinition of roles. And in an institution where roles are everything, even the suggestion of change was enough to ignite widespread attention. The public response was immediate, and it was intense. Questions flooded every corner of discussion. What was being reviewed? Why now? And most importantly, who would be affected? The line of succession, once viewed as untouchable, was suddenly part of the conversation, not because there was evidence of change, but because the possibility had been introduced. And once that possibility exists, it becomes impossible to fully contain. Inevitably, attention turned toward Queen Camilla and her extended family. Her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, found themselves at the center of a narrative they had not directly shaped, yet could not avoid. Their visibility, once a quiet detail, was now being examined with renewed intensity. Not as individuals, but as symbols of a broader question: where exactly does the boundary lie between royal institution and extended connection? Through it all, the palace remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, just a steady refusal to engage with the growing noise. And that silence, rather than calming speculation, seemed to fuel it further. Because in the absence of clarity, interpretation takes over. Every gesture, every appearance, every absence becomes part of the story. And in this case, the story was expanding faster than anyone could control. Social media only accelerated the process. Fragments of information, real and imagined, spread rapidly, merging into narratives that blurred the line between analysis and assumption. The conversation was no longer confined to experts or commentators, it belonged to everyone. And with that came a level of intensity that the monarchy, for all its history, rarely faces in such a concentrated form. Yet beneath the surface of that chaos, something else was happening, something quieter, more deliberate. Because while the world debated possibilities, the institution itself was moving forward, step by measured step, shaping a response that had yet to be fully revealed. But behind the noise and speculation, a deeper shift was already underway, one that would redefine how the monarchy draws its boundaries. Amid the speculation, one truth remained. Altering the line of succession is not a simple decision, it is a constitutional process rooted in law, not emotion. For all the intensity surrounding the unfolding narrative, the foundation of the monarchy remains bound by rules far older and far stronger than any single moment of controversy. The line of succession is not something that can be quietly adjusted behind closed doors or reshaped through influence alone. It is governed by Parliament, defined through statutes, and reinforced by legal frameworks that exist precisely to prevent uncertainty. Every name, every position, every shift requires formal approval, deliberate, public, and unmistakably clear. And that reality stands in sharp contrast to the growing speculation that had begun to dominate the conversation. Because while perception can evolve rapidly, the law does not. It moves slowly, carefully, and only when absolutely necessary. This creates a powerful tension between what people believe might be happening and what is actually possible. Influence, visibility, proximity, these elements can shape narratives, but they do not rewrite constitutional order. And in this case, that distinction is critical. The presence of figures connected to Queen Camilla, including Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, may have sparked conversation, but legally, their position remains unchanged. They are not part of the succession framework, and there is no mechanism that places them within it without significant legislative action. History reinforces this point with clarity. When succession laws have been adjusted in the past, those changes were neither subtle nor immediate. They required coordination between governments, formal declarations, and, in many cases, agreement across multiple nations within the Commonwealth. These were not decisions made in isolation or driven by internal preference. They were structural transformations, undertaken with full visibility and legal authority. And even then, they were approached with caution. recognizing the weight such changes carry. Experts who understand these systems emphasize just how complex any real alteration would be. It is not simply a matter of redefining roles or clarifying positions. It involves legal processes that extend far beyond the monarchy itself, touching on constitutional principles that cannot be easily reshaped. This is why, despite the intensity of speculation, there has been no official indication of any such move, because if there were, it would not remain hidden. It would be announced, debated, and recorded in a way that leaves no room for ambiguity. And yet, the conversation continues, not because the law is unclear, but because the situation surrounding it feels unresolved. There is a growing awareness that something within the institution is shifting, even if that shift does not manifest through formal change. It is a reminder that the monarchy operates on multiple levels: legal, symbolic, and relational. And while one may remain stable, the others can evolve in ways that are harder to define. Which raises the ultimate question: if not a legal shift, then what exactly was changing within the monarchy? This was never just about titles or positions. Beneath the formal structures lay something far more: human power, legacy, and the quiet struggle over who shapes the monarchy's future. Because once the legal arguments are stripped away, what remains is something far more complex and far more difficult to resolve. This is not a battle of statutes or official decrees. It is a clash of visions, subtle, unspoken, yet deeply felt. On one side stands the future, embodied in figures like Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, who are increasingly seen as shaping a monarchy that must adapt, refine, and carefully redefine its place in a changing world. Their approach is not about disruption, but about clarity, about ensuring that the institution remains focused, streamlined, and unmistakably aligned with its core identity. On the other side lies continuity, not in opposition, but in contrast. The influence surrounding Queen Camilla represents something different. It reflects personal networks, long-standing relationships, and a more organic evolution of presence within royal life. It is not driven by formal structure, but by connection. And while that connection carries its own legitimacy, it also introduces a level of fluidity that does not always sit easily within an institution built on precision. This is where the tension truly begins to take shape. Not as a conflict declared openly, but as a quiet divergence in perspective. One vision looks forward, seeking to define the monarchy in terms that are clear, controlled, and sustainable. The other exists within the present, shaped by relationships that have developed over time, resistant to being confined within strict boundaries. Neither is inherently wrong, but together, they create a dynamic that cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. What makes this moment particularly significant is how deeply it reflects a broader generational shift. The monarchy has always evolved, but it does so slowly, often beneath the surface. And now, that evolution is becoming more visible not through dramatic change, but through subtle recalibration. The expectations placed on it are different. The scrutiny it faces is more intense, and the margin for ambiguity has grown smaller. Within that environment, even emotional undertones begin to carry weight. Decisions are not made in isolation from human experience. They are influenced by loyalty, by trust, by the desire to protect not just an institution, but the people within it. And that is where the situation becomes most delicate. Because when strategy intersects with emotion, the path forward is rarely straightforward. What unfolds then is not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a gradual shaping of direction. A series of choices, each one small on its own, but together forming a trajectory that defines where the monarchy is headed. And those choices are being made carefully, with an awareness that every step carries consequences not just for the present, but for the legacy that follows. And in the end, the resolution may not come from confrontation, but from the slow, deliberate evolution of the institution itself. As the dust settles, what remains is not a dramatic overhaul, but a subtle, unmistakable shift. The monarchy, once defined by rigid lines, is quietly redefining its own boundaries. What makes this moment so compelling is not what changed overnight, but what has been carefully reshaped over time. There has been no sweeping declaration, no singular event that marks a clear turning point. Instead, the transformation has unfolded in silence, measured, deliberate, and almost invisible to those not watching closely. The institution has not broken from tradition, it has refined it. And in doing so, it has reinforced a distinction that had begun to blur. the difference between the monarchy as a structured entity and the extended family that surrounds it. This distinction now feels sharper, more intentional, not as a reaction, but as a quiet assertion of identity. The crown, in its essence, is not simply a network of relationships set, is a system built on order, responsibility, and continuity. And within that system, clarity is everything. The subtle recalibration that has taken place serves as a reminder that proximity does not equate to position, and presence does not redefine structure. It restores a sense of balance, not by exclusion, but by reaffirmation. At the center of this evolving dynamic stand Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose influence over the monarchy's future direction has become increasingly apparent. Their approach has not been loud or confrontational. Instead, it has been steady, grounded in a vision that prioritizes stability while acknowledging the need for quiet adaptation. They are not reshaping the monarchy in dramatic strokes, they are guiding it, step by step, toward a version of itself that can endure the pressures of a modern world without losing its core identity. At the same time, Queen Camilla remains firmly within her role, her position neither diminished nor expanded beyond its defined limits. What has changed is not her presence, but the clarity surrounding it. The boundaries that once felt open to interpretation now appear more clearly drawn, not through restriction, but through understanding. It is a balance that allows continuity to coexist with structure, a delicate equilibrium that the monarchy has always relied upon. Even if it is only now being more consciously maintained. Public perception has followed this shift, though not without its own evolution. Where there was once speculation, there is now a growing recognition that what appeared uncertain was, in fact, part of a broader process of adjustment. The narrative has moved from questioning to understanding, from uncertainty to a more measured awareness of how the institution operates beneath the surface. And while curiosity remains, it is no longer fueled by confusion, but by a deeper appreciation of the complexity involved. Because in the end, this was never about a single decision or a single moment. It was about direction, about ensuring that the monarchy continues to function not as a reactive force, but as a steady, enduring presence. Stability has been prioritized, not as a refusal to change, but as a commitment to evolve without losing control. And that evolution, quiet as it may be, is what ultimately defines its strength. Because in the end, the true power of the monarchy has never been in who enters the line, but in who protects the legacy it represents. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.